Well, of course, next week is budget week, and Westpac at least is predicting that it will be one like no other, forecasting a whopping $240 billion deficit. The bank's house view is that personal income tax cuts are likely to be the central theme of the budget, while business investment and infrastructure will be boosted as well. I spoke earlier in the week to Westpac senior economist Matthew Hassan to get his federal budget preview. Matthew Hassan, thanks for joining Business Weekend. Well, of course, let's start with the budget. Now, the government back in July was penciling in a $198 billion deficit for this financial year. I do note that Westpac has $240 billion. How do you explain the difference between the two?
So, on budget night, we are expecting several material packages to emerge. Additional stimulus measures in the form of tax cuts, incentives for business investment, an infrastructure program, and some additional measures around sort of smoothing the transition away from JobKeeper and JobSeeker supplement payments. Altogether, we think that'll add significantly to the cost of the COVID shock, raising the deficit to around $240 billion, 12.5% of GDP. It's an extremely high number by any measure, but given the environment, it's really what's required.
So with deficits that large, surely there's no serious path back to surplus?
Look, I don't think it's a priority, clearly. The number one priority is to return unemployment to more normal levels and to guide the economy through this health crisis. I think there's a sort of in principle view about restoring the fiscal finances over time, and we sort of see that in the commentary from the Treasurer, from Scott Morrison recently, talking about a two-stage policy approach. The first to ensure that the economy is back up and running, and then beyond some point, a restraint around the expenditure and revenue mix that doesn't see any further deterioration. But in terms of restoring the budget to balance or surplus, I don't think that's on the horizon. It will be tomorrow.
Certainly one of the big policy issues that everyone's talking about is whether or not the government will bring forward the second and third stage of the legislated tax cuts. I do note that Westpac is at least hoping that both stages are brought forward. Do you think that that is likely, and why should the government do that?
Look, we think it is likely. As our central case, we think it definitely should do that. I think that sends the very clearest message that the government is mustering all its resources to try and drive a sustained lift in demand by giving an immediate boost to incomes. It's probably the thing that would be the most eye-catching from the budget. The pull forward of all tax measures into basically year one. That's a pretty impressive headline, I think, to get out of a budget, and I think it gives a pretty clear commitment that fiscal policy, which needs to, is stepping up to drive the economy out of this hole.
Well, just onto the expenditure side of the budget now, and we've certainly been hearing a lot about manufacturing. Certainly when I learned economics, we all learnt that picking winners was a bad thing, but it seems that the government will be picking 6 different winners in the manufacturing space. Is that a good idea?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it's probably born out of the circumstance at the moment. Fiscal policy is not a simple lever in the way that monetary policy is, and we used to be, around interest rate changes. With fiscal policy, you need more details, and you need to make some sort of decision about where expenditures or stimulus will go. At some level. And I think beyond a certain point, that does require a bit of guidance in terms of industry policy, and these sorts of measures become part of that. I am like you, I'm a little bit uneasy about this because I know it's a slippery slope. That once you start to go down this path of picking winners, all you need is one success story, and it sort of validates the whole approach regardless of what gets wasted along the way. So I'm a bit wary that if we do really charge into this approach, we could end up with poor investment decisions being made. But I think for the here and now, it's probably a decent way of sort of supplementing the overarching strategy. I think something a little bit beyond just tax cuts or cash up front. It's trying to guide the economy and where we're sort of got to grow. I think that's important at the moment because if you think about what we're going through, the COVID shock, there are some semi-permanent or permanent aspects to this. And a big question that's being raised at the moment is, well, if we're going to be losing jobs permanently in some sectors of the economy, where are we going to pick up the jobs in a sustained way? We might get a mini cycle in housing construction and construction infrastructure, that sort of thing. But where are the permanent industries going to emerge from to really help along the way? And I think that's probably what's behind this thinking.
Now, just looking more broadly at the construction sector, of course, we know the rate of immigration has absolutely collapsed. It is likely, though, that the government will probably spend a bit more on the home builder scheme. Is that a wise move in the context?
There is a tension there. The longer and the harder you go on home building construction, particularly if you don't get a resumption in migration inflows in the future, then you do run the risk down the track of overbuilding. I don't think that's a risk for here and now, but it is one key aspect of the outlook that is of concern. We had some comments from the Treasurer talking about a net migration outflow this year and next. That's almost unprecedented in Australia, and that would be talking about population growth in the 0 to 0.5%, essentially stalling flat, and a much lower underlying requirement for new dwellings. So if we were to go hard on new dwelling construction for 2 or 3 years, that could get us into real problematic territory if migration doesn't come back. And that's one area where it's extremely uncertain. Maybe if we get a vaccine in place, that does happen, but it's less clear. I think with the housing-related supports, I suspect we will get some additional measures around that, although it may move to being something that's done in combination with state government measures rather than federal.
And just more broadly on infrastructure in general, I suppose we could make the same argument there, that we don't need the infrastructure as much. Certainly it was my understanding that the states and the federal government were actually already spending quite a lot. They are about to spend a lot more. Should we be worried at all about that?
I think that's less. There's always a danger of waste. Haste makes waste, and what we're trying to do here is really pull forward a lot of the activity. And so I think there is a risk that we do get with fiscal policy in general. I think there's always this issue around it's more difficult to conjure up programs. It's more difficult to deliver, and waste is a bigger risk. And we have seen this in the past. I think in the current environment, it's less of a risk. A lot of the really big blowouts that happen around infrastructure projects are when it's in combination with an already strong wider economic cycle, and so key sectors around building and construction run into bottlenecks, and it gets really hard to deliver to time frames, and that's where the costs blow out. I don't think that's so much of a risk this time around, but certainly the urgency does give rise to those risks. I think there is still plenty of scope for infrastructure. I don't think we're in danger of overbuilding infrastructure at this stage. Certainly outside of the big southeastern states, New South Wales and Victoria, it's been a long time between drinks for infrastructure building in states like Queensland and Western Australia, and those states are going to be a little bit stronger over the next few years than the big southeastern states. So perhaps there's some scope there, I think.
And just finally, Matthew, on the Reserve Bank, there is some chatter that on Tuesday they will also cut the cash rate from 0.25 to 0.1. Do you think that is likely, and will it make much of a difference if they do?
Look, I think it makes a little bit of difference at the margin. We've had a pretty clear signal from the RBA that they intend to ease policy further. Probably not on budget day. That's kind of reserved for the government announcements rather than the RBA. So we do think they will move in November. Yes, it's a small incremental step from 0.25 to 0.1, but it'll be supplemented by other measures around the term funding program and the asset purchase program, and perhaps there'll be some other things in the mix that will try and generate more traction around real economy activity. One of the focal points around the budget is very much likely to be around business investment and providing additional incentives around investment. So if there's some measures that could improve the credit flow as far as business credit goes, that might be something that supplements the fiscal measures.
And that's all we have time for. Matthew Hassan, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.